Hello, I am Calvin Kelly, and today I will be speaking on the impact of existential crisis on the protection of human rights. So, first off, what is existentialism? Existentialism is a philosophy that came about in the mid 20th century in Europe amid the context of several global conflicts, particularly World War II. Philosophers based this theory on the tenets of understanding the human condition. So, three tenets were the philosophy of culture, the philosophy of nature, and the philosophy of existence. And the conclusions of these understandings focus on uh, self-determination, freedom, and individual existence. Uh, and the basis for existentialism stem from many different kinds of philosophers, but the most notable of which are the ones that I have listed here, which is Descartes, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre. Uh, so then similarly, in 1947, in post-war France, which was uh, a nation that had been liberated from authoritarian rule during World War II, Heidegger wrote an essay on humanism, which argued the similarities of existentialism and humanism, and these and how the two philosophies were philosophies of the understanding of being. This followed the fall of the Third Reich and paralleled the rising concept of global human rights that was kind of percolating through the system of both legal and international leaders in the 1930s and 40s. These philosophies gained more traction following World War II, as the conflict highlighted the discrepancies of if law was representative of ethics and morality. So, for the history of existentialism and human rights, World War II and the atrocities committed by the governments of, for example, Nazi Germany, the Empire of Japan, and others were broadcast and documented in ways that were very novel, um, revolutionary, and unimaginable just a few decades before. People had shocking footage of the effects of the Holocaust and the treatment of the Chinese by the Imperial Chinese military, for example. And this was a reckoning for world leaders and global citizens, as it forced the powers that be to confront that legally appointed governments had sought to persecute their own people and neighboring populations as a means to garner and solidify their political power, repress dissent, and subjugate peoples they deemed inferior. Uh, the suffering and aggrievement that the conflict caused called into question how could this have been avoided? And many of the original framers of the first successful international organizations, such as the United Nations, looked to those existential tenets that I mentioned in the slide before as the basis in which to provide a solid foundation for global individual human rights. So, and how this relates to human rights. So, traditionally, up until that point, the sovereignty of the state had taken preeminence in international relations, and states would typically not interfere in another state's internal affairs. They like very much uh, not my monkey, not my circus kind of uh, thought thought to like, hey, if they're doing that to their own people, that is their choice. Uh, Again, this unspoken agreement eventually led to disaster as international violations of human individual rights spiraled and then spread to neighboring nations and ultimately the world. The destruction of this global order gave rise to the concept of individual rights superseding those of any nation. And the UN Charter kind of codified that for the first time that individual rights of all people for all peoples of the world, which is a direct result of these atrocities and uh, and human rights violations that had occurred in these what were considered very modern governments against their people and other peoples of nations surrounding them. And this gave rise to many countries adopting a pluralistic and collectivist approach in which to frame their laws to better protect and empower the individuals living within their borders and design mechanisms, both legally with civil rights and with various other laws in which the world could hold other nations accountable if they started to violate these human rights. For existentialism and the early framework of human rights. And so proponents of these rights argued that if nations respected the individual's rights to freedom of determination and existence, then conflict would be reduced, as there would be less aggrievement that could cause discontent among world populations. They identified that the enforcement of these rights was crucial in maintaining global peace, as authoritarian style governments inherently sought to create hierarchical systems that perpetuated inequality in the pursuit of accumulating power. You can see that with many different kinds of governments, historically and today. So, fascist governments, authoritarian governments, populist governments, monarchies are among the few I could name off the top of my head. And this often xenophobic attitude towards the individual runs counter to the existentialist takes, as it has been, and it has also been a predictor of conflicts in regions, as the aggrieved eventually try to rebalance this power, either by social change, violent revolution. Either way, they're going to try and rebalance that power. That way, they can get some kind of representation to get their basic needs met. And as international bodies like the UN began to mature, their methods of enforcement did as well. So, to name a few, the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2001, being like international sanctions to enforce uh, uh, penalties on countries that violated human rights, and then creating multilateral agreements with nations, both in the UN or in other kinds of alliances and trade alliances, to create multilateral agreements to respect human rights. So, of course, there are many issues facing human rights in this existentialist kind of framework. Over the last few decades, the rhetoric surrounding human rights has both improved while also encountering challenges from a litany of external factors, both old and new. Mis or dis understanding of the importance of human rights regarding global security and peace. Mis and dis will be explained in the next slide. And the rise of corporations whose power and influence can sometimes outsize many developed nations. Lack of education surrounding the concept of individual human rights and the effects of climate change and the macro long-term effects on individuals. So for the challenges, with the rise of autocratic governments seemingly on the rise around the world, to include several historically democratic societies that we would have never expected to have taken that kind of turn towards populism and authoritarianism. Uh, Collective protection and advocacy is important now more than ever for international human rights. Uh, because as these nations start to slip into these more extreme and hierarchical kinds of ideologies, nations' legal systems can and will fail to protect their vulnerable populations, as the institutions and ethics will begin to erode. Concurrently, private institutions seeking profit over morality will oftentimes petition or lobby these governments to roll back protections and regulations. Uh, once now go through the areas as follows, but again, this is a more novel issue for human rights, as never before have there been so many globalized countries with as much power and money and influence as there are today. You can think of several different large companies which act as umbrellas for many smaller countries, but also have outsized power. But whenever they find these governments that don't have good institutions, they will sometimes petition and lobby that workers' rights and safety aren't as important as the profits that they're making. So they'll be anti-union, anti-safety regulation, or anti-protections. So that way the workers have a safe place to work or aren't exposed to harmful materials or chemicals that can cause long-term illness. as well as the environmental and ecological concerns. So this is something that it's like if they see an ecological or environmental roadblock as a barrier for them to make more profit, they will also fight to roll back those protections as well and marginalize communities. So there's several examples of marginalized communities being displaced or uh, mistreated in areas where they're seen as a impediment to a company being able to exercise its its rights as an entity to generate profit. So if they're in on land that has certain natural resource, or a lower income community is in an area which they wish to build infrastructure, are just a few of the examples that I can use. Uh, and on top of that, apathetic and indifferent groups can tend to be dismissive of the adverse effects of deteriorating human rights conditions, especially if they are shielded to the human cost and suffering associated through isolated information and education systems that otherwise would inform them of larger risks to these trends. So again, this is kind of that it doesn't affect me. So if they don't see human rights as something that personally affects them, it's like, oh, that's always something that's going to affect other people. Again, that's not how it works. The violations to human rights will eventually spread throughout a population and affect everyone. So this is how we can get into the way forward. Uh, with an increasingly fragmented common reality that the world now exists in, with the exponential rise in mis and disinformation that I referenced before, what were traditionally accepted norms are no longer such, and we must put emphasis on rational thinking. So what I mean by that is there is many different core concepts that we have taken for granted as just being commonly known as like, well, this is right. Something as simple as like, well, the sky is blue, or we should trust an expert in medical science. Uh, that protecting human rights helps promote peace by making sure that people aren't aggrieved. But again, like as this information pushes people to the fringe of extreme polar thought, we have to regain that narrative by truly understanding why freedom, individual existence, and self-determination are crucial to securing global peace. Simply saying that human rights are good is enough. We have to be able to explain and rationalize that a global society that strives for equality and fulfilling basic needs creates stability and reduces the suffering for all peoples. And in a world that doesn't advocate for the basic understanding of these existential tenets, um, this is going to cause crisis. And again, like as inequality rises, there's going to be a rebalancing effort, and that cycle will continue until it finds that sort of balance, as I mentioned before. And it's incumbent upon world leaders, businesses, and individuals to inform and be informed on the larger why to in regard to human rights and to build the institutions to respect these existential tenets and foundations of human rights. That way it can protect others and also weather the challenges whenever they arise. That way, whenever a new administration or regime takes over or new form of government, that they survive. Um, that way they can't just be taken away overnight with one administration or leader or thing. There has to be protections in place. And this brings me to the conclusion, which is the existential crisis led to the beginnings of modern human rights. And in no other time in history has there been such an emphasis on protecting individual rights over the nation or state. Again, it is perfectly acceptable to debate whether or not the individual rights outside the nation or state now, but in its current form, if you look historically, individuals have never had this amount of rights globally than any time than now. And these ideals took hold as the world entered a new age of information and access following one of the most horrific periods in world history. However, this is still a novel concept and it's far from its permanency. And if we as a global society wish to maintain this, we must constantly strive to protect it and human rights wherever they're threatened. Thank you.